moment his boarding pass beeped, the cabin changed, subtly, sharply. Not with words, but with glances, with the absence of them. A black man in first class. No logo on his jacket, no entourage, no name that rang familiar in corporate echo chambers, just presence. Still, that was enough. Enough to freeze a greeting mid-sentence. Enough to make his seat feel colder than the rest. It started with a smile withheld, then service withheld, then humanity. What looked like indifference was strategy. What passed as protocol became performance. No one knew who he was. No one asked. And that was their first mistake. What followed tore through headlines, vaporized reputations, and flipped the power dynamic of an entire industry. All from row 3C. If that opening hits you, if you're starting to feel that slow burn beneath the surface, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. And ask yourself, how much does a single assumption really cost? This is the story of the flight that changed everything. The engines outside growled softly, a distant rumble beneath the rain-soaked tarmac. Malachi Dorsey stepped out of the black town car and into the overcast afternoon, a breeze sweeping against his coat as he approached the private terminal of Hayes International. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to high places, sharp in a tailored overcoat, his leather duffel slung over his shoulder, sunglasses tucked precisely into the V of his cashmere scarf. The terminal gleamed with polished stone and glass, filled with whispers of expensive cologne, low conversation, and designer heels clicking on marble. He offered a polite nod to the clerk at the counter. Malachi Dorsey, first class. Flight 726 to Dulles. The young attendant behind the counter glanced at his monitor, then back at Malachi. For a moment, just a flicker, his expression stalled, but then recovered with a forced smile. Yes, Mr. Dorsey, you're in seat 3C. We'll begin pre-boarding shortly. Malachi thanked him with a nod and moved into the lounge, scanning the other faces, mostly executives and socialites, sipping espresso and pretending not to look at one another. He chose a seat near the window, watching the rain streak across the tarmac. The boarding call crackled over the intercom not long after, and he stood with quiet purpose, joining the small group of early boarders. At the jet bridge, a red-headed flight attendant greeted passengers with syrupy warmth. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Roush," she beamed, patting a white-haired man on the shoulder as he stepped through. Then she turned to Malachi. Her smile didn't just fade, it vanished. "Boarding pass?" she asked curtly. Malachi handed it over, without comment. She glanced at it for half a second. 3C, she muttered. "Fine. Proceed." No welcome. No gesture, just dismissed. Inside, the cabin shimmered with luxury. Wide seats with leather trim, gold-stitched headrests, and a glow of soft lighting. Malachi found 3C, stowed his bag neatly overhead, and sat down, his posture composed. Across the aisle, a businessman gave him a polite nod, which Malachi returned. Then came the tray. A second flight attendant began working her way down the aisle with a tray of champagne flutes. She smiled graciously at each passenger, offering bubbly as if it were a ritual. The first row was served, then the second, then the third, except when she reached 3C, her smile faltered. She glanced at Malachi's seat, then continued on as if he wasn't there. Malachi watched, quiet. The tray passed. The glass skipped. He didn't flinch. Not yet. A moment passed. He reached calmly for the service button. The soft chime sounded above. Then, nothing. 3 minutes. No one came. He pressed again. Still nothing. Another 10 minutes passed. The red-headed attendant, the same one from the jet bridge, passed his row. "Excuse me," Malachi said, voice even. She paused, visibly annoyed. "Yes. I pressed the service button twice. I haven't been offered anything yet." She folded her arms slightly. "We'll get to you when we can," she replied flatly, then walked away. Row 4, directly behind him, was being offered bourbon and soft towels. A young woman in 2A was now sipping a mimosa, flipping through a magazine. Malachi sat untouched, unseen. A few moments later, another attendant approached the passenger in 3B. "Would you like to pre-select your dinner, sir?" the attendant asked with warmth. Malachi raised a brow. He hadn't received any menu. "Excuse me," he said again. "I haven't received a dinner menu." The redhead, Kendra. He read her name tag now, cut back in. Her tone clipped. "We have limited extras tonight." Then she turned her attention to the white couple in 2D and 2E, offering them custom options and a second pillow. Malachi sat still, staring at the soft golden lights lining the cabin ceiling. He could feel the pressure in his chest, not from anger, not yet, but from the deep, familiar recognition. He knew this rhythm, being erased without anyone daring to say why. The final passenger boarded, a woman in a pristine white wrap. Kendra lit up as she approached. "Mrs. Payton, so lovely to have you again." They exchanged pleasantries and laughter. Kendra offered her a mimosa on the spot and walked her to her seat personally. The tray carts rattled closer down the aisle, and he watched as the attendant he now recognized as Kendra Voss moved with choreographed ease. She smiled at each passenger, making note of preferences, recommending wine pairings. Her tone was warm, almost flirtatious, with some of the men. Her energy shifted like theater lighting, cheerful and eager for some, indifferent or absent for others. When she reached the elderly couple in 2A and 2B, she knelt beside them, guiding their choices gently. "We've got filet with peppercorn sauce or the miso sea base. And of course, Chef Javier's wild mushroom risotto. May I tempt you?" she asked with a gentle lilt. They chuckled. She offered them a complimentary bottle of Chardonnay from Napa and took her time ensuring they were satisfied. Malachi turned his head slightly as she stepped to the next row. The man in 3B, a tech executive from what Malachi could gather from his phone call earlier, was offered both entrees and asked if he had any dietary restrictions. When Kendra finally turned to Malachi, her demeanor shifted as if a curtain had dropped. She didn't kneel, didn't smile. "We're out of selections," she said bluntly. "I can get you the cheese plate or nothing." Her voice held no apology, no explanation. She turned to the cart without waiting for a reply. Malachi's lips parted for a moment, but no words came out. His stomach turned, not from hunger, but from something deeper, more toxic. He looked behind her and noticed another tray, untouched, sitting just above the warmer. The cheese plate, when it arrived, was lukewarm and dry, clearly pre-prepared and pulled from the bottom of the stack. He stared at it for a moment, then gently placed the lid back on top. "No, thank you," he thought, not out of pride, but protection. Minutes later, a junior attendant named Rena walked past with a breadbasket. Malachi caught her eye. "Excuse me," he said, calm as ever. "May I have some water, please?" Her eyes softened. "Of course, sir," she said with sincerity. She walked toward the galley, but before she could return, Malachi saw Kendra intercept her. There were no raised voices, just body language, Kendra's sharp gestures, Rena's hesitant nod. Rena returned several minutes later, empty-handed. She avoided Malachi's gaze. The cart moved on, row by row. Across the aisle, a man laughed at a joke his companion told. Wine glasses clinked. The scent of the filet wafted back again. Malachi pressed the call button one more time. The light blinked. Nothing. He folded his hands together in his lap, fingers interlaced, eyes steady. He was not going to break, not here. Another round of drinks came by. Kendra offered them with theatrical flair, pouring directly from the bottle for passengers in rows 1 and 2. When she reached his row, she didn't even glance at him. She poured for 3B, offered him a refill of sparkling water, and placed a napkin under his glass. Then she stepped past Malachi again, never once acknowledging him. Malachi adjusted his seat back and exhaled slowly. The red-headed attendant passed again, laughing at something the woman in 2D said. Malachi watched her move with ease through the cabin, weaving inclusion and exclusion like threads. He knew the signs. This wasn't about capacity or timing. This was deliberate. This was practiced. The man in 3B leaned slightly toward him. "Hey," he whispered, "did you not get a meal? I thought I saw one left." Malachi gave a short nod, his voice measured. Apparently they ran out. 3B frowned. "That's odd. They offered me both options, and said there were extras. He hesitated, seemed unsure if he should press further. Malachi offered him a nod of assurance. "It's all right," he said. "This isn't new." He turned back toward the window, watching the clouds drift by, dense and unmoving. The sensation wasn't just of being unseen, but of being unwanted. He hadn't spoken a word out of line, hadn't demanded, hadn't shown frustration. But still, he was being treated like a trespasser. It wasn't about who he was. It was about what they saw when they looked at him, and what they chose not to see. The cabin lights dimmed slightly for the evening cruise. Passengers slipped into their blankets, sipped nightcaps, or watched movies on silent screens. Malachi reclined his seat, but did not close his eyes. He sat with a mind too active, replaying each moment from the past 2 hours. Not once had he been treated as an equal, not in tone, not in service, not in humanity. His shoulders remained squared, spine straight, expression controlled. But beneath that polished exterior, something heavy was taking root. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the helplessness. Not one person, not even the junior attendant, had dared to speak on what they saw. Complicity, he thought, is always quiet. Somewhere above the Rockies, as the cabin dipped into a lull of calm, Malachi reached for his notebook. He didn't open it to work. He simply held it in his lap, fingers resting on the cover. He thought of his father, how he'd once said, "Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is stay silent." And yet, here he was, silent, diminished. Malachi had made a career out of calm resilience. He had weathered boardrooms of skepticism, investor panels who questioned his every word. He had spoken with grace in the face of subtle slights, microaggressions masked as compliments. But this wasn't subtle. This was systemic cruelty wrapped in a smile and sealed in airline protocol. He didn't move because every movement invited scrutiny. He didn't speak because every word would be examined. He sat there, contained and silent, like a man who understood the cost of taking up space where people didn't think he belonged. The sting from the last stage still pulsed in his chest, the way his request for water had been shut down by an unspoken command, the way even his silence was framed as defiance. Kendra Voss, now sipping from her own bottle of sparkling water in the galley, leaned casually against the counter and smirked as she spoke to the male attendant beside her, a tall man with sandy hair and a too-easy smile. "Some people think money buys manners," she said, not bothering to whisper. Her voice was pitched perfectly to carry over the quiet cabin, laced with venom wrapped in casual sarcasm. Her eyes flicked directly toward Malachi's seat, then quickly away, like she hadn't just tagged him in front of a dozen people. The male attendant chuckled nervously, uncertain whether to agree or retreat. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The damage was done. Malachi's ears caught every syllable. His back remained straight, eyes fixed on the dark screen in front of him, but the words landed like fists. The insinuation was deliberate. She didn't need to name him. She didn't need to shout. It was the audacity of her ease, the comfort with which she humiliated him in public, that carved deepest. Around him, a few passengers shifted awkwardly. A man across the aisle, who'd offered him a nod earlier, looked down at his tablet. A woman a row ahead paused her movie, glanced back, then looked away. Not a single person spoke. Malachi swallowed against the rising heat in his throat. He felt exposed, not just disrespected, but deliberately unprotected in a space meant to offer exclusivity and comfort. Here, he was the exception, but not in the way he deserved. 20 minutes later, turbulence struck. The lights flickered gently, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through a mild pocket of turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." A few bumps followed, soft tremors rolling through the fuselage like distant thunder. The seatbelt sign blinked overhead. Malachi hadn't moved. His seatbelt had never been unfastened. Still, Kendra took the opportunity. She walked swiftly down the aisle, her stride tighter now, eyes sweeping the rows as if searching for an excuse to pounce. When she reached Malachi's row, she stopped abruptly and raised her voice just enough to command the attention of those nearby. "Sir, I said please remain seated," she snapped. Her tone was sharp, performative, and unnecessary. Everyone in earshot turned. A man 4 rows back leaned slightly to see what was happening. Malachi looked up slowly. "I am seated," he said, his voice firm but even. His hands rested visibly on the armrests. His seatbelt was fastened. His tray was up. His posture was impeccable. Kendra blinked as if caught off guard, then immediately recalibrated. "Then don't move around," she muttered. She turned on her heel and walked away, her back stiff, her authority unchallenged, at least officially. The eyes that had turned now turned away again. No one said a word. Malachi sat still, watching her retreat, a pressure growing steadily in his chest. It wasn't the turbulence that made him feel unstable. It was the performance, the calculated choice to humiliate him under the guise of regulation. 15 minutes passed before calm returned to the cabin. Passengers began to stretch again, drink again, shift under blankets. But for Malachi, the pressure lingered. He realized now he wasn't just being ignored or overlooked. He was being targeted, slowly, strategically. Every interaction designed to reduce him. His status, his seat, his silence. It all meant nothing in the face of a woman who had decided he was unwelcome. And the crew followed her lead. Maybe they didn't agree. Maybe they didn't even notice. But they did nothing. They said nothing. And that, Malachi knew, was as dangerous as the offense itself. He reached for his notebook again, not to write, but to grip something familiar. His fingers pressed against the leather cover. His eyes never left the front of the cabin, where Kendra now laughed softly with the pilot outside the cockpit door. He watched her posture, her ease, the way her eyes scanned the room. She thrived in this environment, wielded it like a weapon. It was her kingdom, and he was the unwanted trespasser. Malachi knew better than to cause a scene. He had spent a lifetime avoiding the trap of being labeled angry or difficult. But restraint, he was beginning to realize, had a cost. Silence was not always a shield. Sometimes it was a shackle. As the crew began clearing trays and offering after-dinner mints, Kendra skipped his row once again. She smiled sweetly at the man beside him. "Would you like a chocolate mint, sir?" she asked. He declined. She didn't even glance at Malachi. She moved on as if he wasn't there. The cabin smelled like coffee and vanilla. Malachi smelled nothing but contempt. Near the galley, a younger passenger stood to stretch. She appeared to hesitate, then made her way toward Malachi's row. She bent down slightly and whispered, "Excuse me, sir. I saw earlier when she said that about money. That wasn't okay." Her voice was soft, uncertain. She was maybe 25, with hesitant eyes. Malachi gave her a slight smile. "Thank you," he said gently. "But don't worry about me." She nodded quickly and disappeared back to her seat. Her acknowledgement meant something. Not enough to erase the sting, but enough to keep him from feeling completely invisible. Malachi sat still, one leg crossed over the other, his notebook untouched now, resting flat on his tray table. He had not spoken since the turbulence incident, not moved beyond adjusting his seat. And yet, a quiet tension swirled in the air around him. Denser now, heavier than the recycled oxygen flowing through the cabin vents. He could feel the energy shift long before the co-pilot approached. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Then, the sound of slow, measured footsteps padding along the carpeted aisle. The co-pilot, tall, lean, clean-shaven, stopped beside Malachi's seat and leaned down slightly, his voice low, but his presence commanding. "Mr. Dorsey," he said, "could I speak with you privately for a moment? Just up near the galley." Malachi looked up, his expression impassive. "Of course," he replied evenly. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood, and followed the man without hesitation. Heads turned as he walked, eyes trailing him, not with interest, but curiosity sharpened by the scent of scandal. Near the front galley, away from passenger ears, but not entirely out of view, the co-pilot folded his arms and dropped his voice. "I wanted to inform you that a report was filed regarding your behavior in the cabin." Malachi blinked slowly. "A report?" "Yes, sir," the man continued. The flight lead documented that you've been pressing the call button excessively and behaving in a way that's creating discomfort among the crew. For a moment, silence passed between them. Malachi felt his pulse slow rather than rise. His voice, when it came, was deliberate. I've pressed it 3 times. Over 4 hours. Each time, I received no response. The co-pilot looked uncomfortable. I understand, Mr. Dorsey. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I'm simply informing you that the report exists and that the crew is following protocol. Malachi studied the man's face. No anger, just quiet calculation. He knew how this worked. Language like protocol was a shield for liability. Is this standard practice? Malachi asked. To label silence as disruption? The co-pilot exhaled. Look, I don't make those calls. I just communicate them. He glanced around, lowering his voice further. Off the record, I'd lay low for the rest of the flight. We land in less than 2 hours. Malachi nodded once, sharply. Understood. He returned to his seat in silence, passing passengers who avoided eye contact. He sat down and buckled his belt, folding his arms as his chest tightened under the weight of the accusation. A report. He had said nothing, had made no scene, but still, his presence alone had been written up like a threat. The power to define a narrative, that was what she had used now. Not just silence, not just exclusion, but story. Kendra Voss had planted a lie and let it take root in official records. The cabin seemed to shrink around him. As the lights brightened slightly for pre-landing preparation, Kendra made her way down the aisle once more. This time she stopped at the overhead bin above Malachi's seat, opened it with force, and began rearranging the contents. Random bin check, she muttered to the air, not to him. Malachi's briefcase, an expensive leather piece engraved with his initials, sat perfectly aligned in the corner. Kendra yanked a blanket from beside it with a sudden jerk, sending the briefcase toppling from its perch. It landed on the aisle floor with a solid thud. Malachi flinched and turned instinctively. The impact had caused the case to split slightly at the zipper. Papers slid partially out. Kendra glanced down, offered no apology, and continued her search. She moved a few items back and forth, then closed the bin and walked away without a word. Malachi stared after her, then reached down, retrieved the case, and gently pushed the papers back into place. He zipped the case, set it at his feet, and sat back, stone-faced. The man in 3B leaned over cautiously. That seemed unnecessary, he whispered. Malachi said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had known from the moment he boarded that some eyes saw him as an anomaly. Now, they saw him as a problem. And worse, Kendra had made it official. Minutes later, the co-pilot walked past again. Malachi caught him pause briefly, his eyes darting to the briefcase on the floor. He said nothing but walked on faster this time, as though he didn't want to be caught looking. Malachi closed his eyes for a moment, not in rest, but to contain the fire building inside. He had been denied basic service, insulted in front of the cabin, falsely accused of misconduct, and now his belongings had been tossed to the floor like refuse. The strategy was clear: provoke, escalate, then report. And the silence from the rest of the crew allowed it to stand. Even as the flight approached descent, Malachi remained trapped inside an invisible prison. The structure around him was not made of steel or locks, but of innuendo, manipulation, and false narratives. He imagined how the report would read. Passenger refused to comply with service limitations. Exhibited disruptive behavior. Required private advisement. Those words typed into a crew log could follow him for years, flag him in databases, affect future travel, feed future biases. Kendra hadn't just hurt his pride. She had weaponized the system, and she had done it with a smile. He glanced toward the galley where her voice still echoed, light and pleasant as she joked with another passenger. The mask never dropped, not when she was performing. Only with him. His fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. He still had not raised his voice, not stood in the aisle, not demanded anything. And yet, he was being treated as though he had. He knew that in this world, perception often overruled truth. And Kendra had written a version of reality that painted him as the problem. It wasn't just about how she treated him now. It was about how the airline would see him forever. The man in 3C, disruptive, difficult, threatening. No one would question why there had been no meal, no water, no interaction. They would just see the report. The false report lingered in his mind, more violating than anything else that had happened so far, because it didn't just erase his experience, it rewrote it with venom. He had always known that dignity could be fragile, but he hadn't expected to watch his own get filed away in an official report as if he'd done something wrong. He stared at the seat ahead of him, breathing evenly, controlling what little he had left, his reaction. That was the only thing left that was still his. Kendra Voss moved past his row once, her expression tight and focused. She said nothing to him, not even a glance, but he knew she was planning something. The air around her buzzed with suppressed energy, like someone bracing for one last move to ensure a message landed. She returned to the front galley, spoke briefly with the junior attendant, then disappeared through the service door. When she came back, she had a silver spray bottle in one hand and a bundle of wipes in the other. She moved slowly down the aisle, smiling at a few passengers along the way, but her real focus was Malachi. He knew it before she even reached his row. She stopped at 3C and leaned in slightly, holding the bottle high. "We're just doing a quick sanitization pass before landing," she said. Her voice was loud enough to be heard by the nearby rows, and her tone had that artificial brightness that barely covered the malice beneath. Before Malachi could respond, she began spraying. Not the air, not surfaces around the seat. She sprayed directly over his seat and armrests, misting the leather, his folded tray, the headrest, even the airspace just inches from his shoulder. The scent of industrial-grade disinfectant burned Malachi's nostrils. He flinched slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of the act. She muttered, more to herself than anyone else, "Just being safe. You never know these days." The insinuation struck like a slap. Her words carried implication, veiled threat, judgment. She had turned cleanliness into contamination, as if his presence required sterilization. Passengers nearby looked up. A few exchanged glances. No one said a word. Malachi sat motionless, shoulders stiff, allowing the spray to settle without reacting. He would not give her the satisfaction of flinching further. He had already been falsely accused, ignored, insulted. Now he was being publicly decontaminated like a hazard. As she wiped down the seatbelt clasp with exaggerated care, she added, "Sometimes these planes pick up all kinds of things. Better to be thorough." She moved on then, leaving a haze of citrus chemical behind her. Malachi's jaw tightened. He didn't speak. His breathing remained slow, steady, deliberate. He had learned long ago that dignity wasn't always about speaking out. Sometimes it was about surviving intact. But this was the kind of moment that carved itself into memory forever. The moment you realized not even silence could shield you from hatred dressed as procedure. Kendra returned to the galley, and moments later, the intercom clicked on. The captain's voice was calm but firm, the kind of rehearsed tone that suggested seriousness without panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our descent into Dulles, we remind all passengers that inappropriate behavior, harassment, or failure to comply with crew instructions will be addressed immediately upon landing. Thank you for your cooperation." The message was generic, but the timing was surgical. Every passenger in earshot turned again, glancing toward Malachi. Their eyes didn't hold open hostility, just the dull, trained suspicion that came from hearing an authority figure issue a warning and instinctively searching for the cause. Kendra had not just made him invisible. She had painted him as dangerous. Without ever raising her voice or making a scene, she had orchestrated a public condemnation that wrapped around him like chains. He wasn't just the man skipped for dinner or ignored for water anymore. He was the one people now watched. Malachi sat still, his knuckles pale against the armrest. His heart thudded slow and hard in his chest. He had done nothing, said nothing, but she had ensured that perception would do the work truth never got the chance to. Even the man in 3B, who had earlier tried to offer a word of comfort, now shifted slightly away in his seat, no longer making eye contact. It was instinct, self-preservation. No one wanted to be too close to a man flagged by authority. Malachi understood that. Didn't forgive it, but understood it. 10 minutes later, as the plane began its final descent, Kendra walked by one last time. She glanced at Malachi, and then, as if confirming something internally, leaned down just enough for only him to hear. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," she said quietly, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Next time, don't start things you can't finish." She walked off again, her shoes tapping softly on the carpet. Her final blow wasn't loud, but it was the cruelest. It was the voice of someone who believed themselves untouchable. She had written the report. She had sprayed him like he was filth. She had turned the cabin against him. And now, she'd laid down her final judgment. He was alone, accused, humiliated, and worst of all, powerless to stop it. As the plane's wheels touched down with a soft jolt, the lights flicked up and the hum of disembarking began. People stirred, stretched, gathered their bags. Malachi remained still for a moment longer, watching the flurry of movement around him. He knew better than to rise too quickly. The last thing he needed was another accusation that he stood too fast, reached too suddenly, moved too confidently. Even now, on the ground, he walked on ice. He bent down, retrieved his briefcase, checked that the zipper still held. Then he stood and waited. No one offered a word. No one offered a glance. He was no longer a guest in this cabin. He was a problem that had been managed. Passengers around him busied themselves with phones, carry-ons, and casual chatter. He stood when the chime sounded, unhurried, retrieving his briefcase with controlled precision. As he adjusted the strap over his shoulder, a small commotion stirred a few rows behind him. A young female attendant, Rena, the only one who had earlier shown him any shred of human decency, approached him with a clear plastic water bottle in hand. Her face held a nervous kind of empathy, as if she knew she was treading on hostile ground. "Mr. Dorsey," she said quietly, "would you like some water while we wait to deplane?" Before Malachi could respond, Kendra appeared, stepping between them with the speed and finality of a gate slamming shut. Her body blocked Rena's, her voice sharp and dry. "Rena," she snapped, "take care of the real guests first." She didn't look at Malachi as she spoke. She didn't need to. The phrase hit with surgical cruelty. Not the other guests. Not priority passengers. She'd said real guests, effectively drawing a line in the sand and placing Malachi on the other side of it. Rena hesitated, eyes widening, mouth parting as if to protest, but a look from Kendra silenced her. The bottle of water was pulled back without being handed over. Malachi, standing tall but rooted in place, said nothing. He refused to engage, not because he lacked the will, but because any reaction would be used as proof of aggression. He knew the game by now. As the first-class cabin emptied, one row at a time, Kendra remained near the galley, watching. Malachi stepped forward, the last in his row to exit. He had barely passed row 1 when Kendra moved again, this time toward the flight officer, whispering something quickly. Her eyes were on Malachi, her tone low but urgent. The officer, a stern woman in uniform, turned toward him and lifted a hand. "Sir," she said, "I need to take a quick look at your seat before you leave." Malachi stopped, blinking once. "Is there a problem?" "We received a report of tampering with the seat adjustment mechanism," she stated, already walking toward his row. He followed her, silent. The other passengers now fully engaged in watching what looked like the end of a confrontation they hadn't witnessed. Malachi stood by as the officer bent down, inspected the seat, the footrest, the controls. It took less than a minute for her to straighten, frown slightly, and glance at him. "There's nothing out of order," she said flatly, more to Kendra than to him. Kendra, who now stood behind her, nodded once and offered a tight, professional smile. "Appreciate you checking," she said. No apology, no correction, just another false report made fact by performance. Malachi exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. "I trust there's no further issue," he asked, his tone neither cold nor warm. "No, sir," the officer replied, already walking away. The remaining passengers shuffled past, eyes locked on screens or luggage, avoiding him like he was radioactive. He stepped out of the cabin at last, into the jet bridge, the sterile brightness of the airport terminal washing over him like a harsh, fluorescent curtain. But the damage was already cemented. He had been denied service, ridiculed, falsely accused, sprayed down like a biohazard, and now, just before release, publicly labeled suspicious once again, all with no recourse, no ally, no justice. Outside the jet bridge, an airline supervisor waited with a clipboard, but her presence wasn't for him. She met Kendra with a polite nod as the crew exited behind Malachi. He could hear their voices fading behind him, and though he didn't look back, he could feel the invisible wall that had followed him the entire flight still pressing at his back. He moved through the terminal, a man once more in a world that welcomed his money but not his presence. Each step away from that plane felt less like escape and more like aftermath, the echo of psychological warfare lingering in his breath. He made his way to the rideshare pickup in silence, ignoring the flashes of sympathy from two passengers who had seen the events unfold but done nothing to intervene. Sympathy was useless now. What had happened wasn't simply the result of poor service or a bad mood. It had been engineered, calculated, a multi-phase assault designed to strip him of comfort, agency, and identity. The phrase "real guests" looped in his mind. That moment, more than any other, was the one that would stay with him. Because it hadn't been whispered. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been said out loud in front of him and a colleague, with deliberate clarity. Kendra had drawn that line not just between herself and him, but between him and the legitimacy of belonging. That wound cut deepest. His car arrived. The driver, a quiet man with kind eyes, helped load his briefcase without question. As they pulled into traffic, Malachi sat in the back seat, the city lights blurring through the window. He pulled out his phone, not to scroll or call, but to stare at the blank screen. His reflection stared back, tired, composed, tight-lipped. He didn't look broken. He looked like a man forced to hold himself together because the alternative would confirm every lie told about him. The car curved onto the freeway, the hum of the tires against asphalt oddly soothing. But Malachi didn't feel soothed. He felt scorched. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving the terminal, hadn't needed to. Everything he had endured in the past 6 hours had already begun to form a chain, each link forged in humiliation, insult, and false accusation. But he hadn't just survived it. He had recorded it, remembered it, filed it, and now he was going to use it. The car pulled into the circular drive of the Hotel Ardent, an upscale business retreat known for its discretion and client loyalty. A doorman opened the car door before the vehicle fully stopped. "Welcome back, Mr. Dorsey," he said with a nod, and Malachi stepped out with the same steady elegance he'd carried onto the flight, only now it had teeth. The hotel manager appeared instantly, clipboard in hand, suit pressed to perfection. "Chairman Dorsey," he said warmly, "your suite has been prepared. Your assistant is waiting in the executive lounge. Shall I have your luggage brought up?" Malachi nodded once. "Yes, and send up a carafe of black coffee. Strong." He walked through the glass doors like a man whose every step had been earned, every glance pre-calculated. Here, in this space, no one questioned his presence. They bent around it. Inside the elevator, the floor count ticked upward, and Malachi loosened his collar slightly, not from fatigue, but from readiness. His reflection in the mirrored walls showed no trace of the pain inflicted earlier, but it lived beneath the surface. The false report, the disinfectant, the stolen water, the last-minute accusation of tampering. All of it had been done with surgical malice. And now he would operate with surgical precision. The doors opened onto the executive floor. A woman in a tailored black suit stood at the end of the hallway, tablet in one hand, her posture alert. "Chairman Dorsey," she said. "The legal team confirmed receipt of the onboard footage request. The video will be delivered within 6 hours. We've also located the employee profile on Kendra Voss." Malachi nodded as he passed. "Anything else?" "There's more," she said. "May I show you?" They stepped into the suite, a spacious, modern corner room with full windows overlooking the skyline. On the central console screen, his assistant brought up a live news alert. The headline flashed in bold. Airline employee suspended pending investigation. Second incident emerges. Below it, a blurred image of Kendra Voss, arms crossed in a security photo, her badge half visible. Malachi stepped closer. She was previously cited in a 2022 discrimination complaint. The assistant continued. Buried quickly, never went to legal. The complainant was a black tech investor out of Austin. No formal action was taken. The airline issued a training memo, but nothing stuck. Our team flagged her name the moment your flight was assigned. They sent the red flag alert while you were airborne. Malachi absorbed the information without blinking. So she's done this before. Yes, sir. And she learned how to cover it up. He turned away from the screen and poured a glass of water from the bar. His hand didn't shake. Not this time, he said quietly. Let's proceed. The assistant tapped a few commands into the tablet. Your media contact is preparing a statement. The legal draft for the cease and desist is ready to launch by morning. And the chairman of the airline's board is expecting your call at 8. Malachi sat down at the desk, laid the glass of water beside him, and opened his laptop. As the screen lit up, a flurry of notifications appeared. Messages from his chief counsel, PR liaison, and the diversity equity officer from his holding company. All were awaiting direction. He didn't rush to respond. Not yet. The storm had just begun forming. For months, his company had been working quietly on a multi-billion-dollar transportation investment deal, one that included strategic partnerships with 2 major airlines. He hadn't publicly disclosed the specifics. Most of the corporate world still assumed he was interested only in rail. But Malachi Dorsey played the long game. And today, someone had mistaken his silence for weakness. Someone had decided that a black man in first class was a threat to be neutralized. That mistake would cost them, not with anger, with leverage. As he reviewed the flagged report on Kendra's employment history, his mind moved with chilling clarity. Her pattern wasn't just reckless, it was institutional. Her behavior had been supported by a crew that looked the other way, a system that preferred silence over accountability. They had tried to shrink him, reduce him to a problem, a note in a logbook. But they had misread their target. Malachi Dorsey wasn't just a businessman, he was a strategist. And this flight had just become the fulcrum of a very public reckoning. Pull the list of all passengers on Flight 726, he said. I want to know who sat where and who saw what. His assistant nodded, already accessing the manifest. And begin tracking public reaction. Monitor keywords. Push controlled leaks if necessary. Nothing too direct. Let the media circle first. She moved quickly, knowing that when he entered this mode, precision was king. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He shifted tides. The room was already occupied. His lead legal counsel, public relations chief, and operations liaison sat at the oval table, their laptops open, their eyes expectant. This wasn't a damage control meeting. It was a declaration of intent. Malachi took his seat at the head of the table, unfolded a single sheet of paper from his briefcase, and placed it before them. At the top was a title, Strategic Partnership Clause 14.3, Conduct Risk Termination. The others leaned in, reading the highlighted segment. This, Malachi began, his voice low but resonant, is the clause that changes everything. He tapped the line with a fingertip. As of midnight, Flight 726 triggered a material breach in our DEI compliance agreement with Altura Aviation. A member of their in-flight leadership staff not only engaged in discriminatory behavior, but did so under direct observation and within the scope of recorded airline protocol. That behavior and the crew's documented silence places them in violation of the core ethics terms tied to our $2.9 billion joint venture. A collective stillness swept through the room, broken only by the PR chief's sharp inhale. Chairman, she said carefully, are you confirming that the contract can be voided with cause? Malachi's gaze never wavered. Yes, and we will. The PR chief opened her laptop and began pulling files. We've already prepared a multi-phase response. Media briefing draft, private shareholder statement, Internal memo for your company's partners. Once you issue the decision, we'll time the releases. The legal counsel chimed in. There's no gray area. Their HR policies cite zero tolerance on discrimination. Kendra Voss's name is already surfacing from your team's leak last night. If we move now, we control the story. Malachi nodded. We're not here to punish one employee. We're exposing a system. I want the airline's board to feel the ground move. Back at Altura Aviation Headquarters, the tremors had already begun. At precisely 8:07 a.m., the CEO received a private email flagged urgent. Breach notification, Chairman Dorsey. The message came with an attached report, complete with time-stamped logs from Flight 726, a summary of Malachi's onboard treatment, and a legal advisory citing their contractual breach. The CEO, Russell Brandt, sat stunned. He hadn't known Malachi was even on the flight. He hadn't known Kendra Voss's prior behavior had been flagged by legal. And he certainly hadn't expected a statement at the bottom of the report that read, pending breach confirmation, the $2.9 billion strategic partnership will be terminated within 48 hours. The timing was lethal. They had just gone live with their annual shareholder forecast, banking heavily on the Dorsey deal to stabilize future projections. Panic cracked the air around him. He called legal, then PR, then HR. Each one confirmed the report's details, and each one sounded like they were preparing for war. Within an hour, Altura Aviation's internal Slack channels lit up with chatter. Executives whispered about Dorsey's team reaching out to major media outlets. Stock analysts caught wind of the breach and began circulating early warnings to institutional investors. The airline shares, already volatile, began to dip. Brandt called an emergency board meeting. We need to fix this, he barked. Offer him a public apology, fire the attendant, launch a retraining initiative, whatever it takes. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were flailing. This wasn't just a PR crisis. This was a structural detonation. They had broken a trust tied to billions. In Malachi's suite, the response strategy was already in motion. Send the timeline to the media, he said. Let them see how it unfolded in real time. Make it visual. His operations liaison nodded. We've synced footage timestamps with your assistant's notes. It shows a clear pattern from boarding to deplaning. No room for doubt. And Kendra, pulled from active duty this morning. She's under internal review, but no apology has been issued publicly. Malachi's jaw set slightly. Then we proceed. Make it clear, this isn't about retribution. It's about accountability. As the markets opened, financial feeds buzzed with updates. Altura Aviation faces $2.9 billion fallout after discrimination breach. One headline read. Another. Chairman Dorsey may terminate deal. Altura stock slides 11%. On financial news networks, anchors speculated about the broader implications. A CNN panelist noted, this isn't just about a bad flight. This is a reckoning for corporate diversity accountability. Companies can't preach equity and then protect racism in practice. By noon, the airline's valuation had dropped by nearly 14%. Internal investors called emergency sessions. Letters poured in from advisory boards demanding clarification. And across the internet, the clip of Kendra spraying Malachi's seat, leaked from a phone video taken by a silent witness in row 4, began to circulate, drawing over 2 million views in 4 hours. Malachi watched it once, not to relive the humiliation, but to verify the visual clarity. It showed everything. The silence, the body language, the moment her words, just being safe, landed like acid. It was undeniable. It was systemic. And it was now viral. His assistant entered the room again. The White House's Office of Economic Inclusion just reached out. They'd like to schedule a conversation regarding broader industry compliance. Malachi glanced at the alert, nodded. Tell them we're open next week. She hesitated, then added, the airline's chairman just left a voicemail. He's offering to meet you privately. Terms undisclosed. Malachi didn't smile. He's not the one who gets to set terms now. Draft my response. Politely decline. We'll release our findings at 5. The termination takes immediate effect. All affiliated business initiatives are hereby suspended. Malachi didn't need to attach emotion to the statement. The consequences would speak for themselves. Within 6 minutes of the press release, Altura stock took a second nosedive. Shedding another 8% before trading was halted temporarily to avoid a full-blown crash. Traders scrambled, brokers sent emergency emails to clients, and analysts tried to spin last-minute projections. But the damage had already metastasized beyond containment. Inside Altura's corporate tower in Chicago, the atmosphere was pure chaos. CEO Russell Brand paced across the conference room as board members fired off questions like bullets. Why wasn't this flagged earlier? How many other crew complaints have we suppressed? Who vetted the DEI compliance audit? And most importantly, how did we not know that Chairman Dorsey was on that flight? Their legal team confirmed what Malachi's had already discovered. Kendra Voss had been involved in 2 prior internal incidents, both involving passengers of color. Both had been resolved quietly with training recommendations and sealed notes. Nothing had escalated until now. But this time, the victim hadn't been anonymous. This time, the victim was one of the most powerful private equity figures in the country, whose silence held more weight than a courtroom testimony. As the boardroom thundered with accusations, Brandt's phone buzzed with the final blow. Altura's largest institutional investor, a multinational fund with holdings in over 50 industries, had just released a statement withdrawing all pending investment and re-evaluating their stake in the airline. That translated to a pullback of nearly $600 million, effective immediately. We can't justify a position in a company that fails to uphold its own ethics code, the message read. The board fell silent. The floor beneath Altura Aviation cracked wide open. Kendra Voss, now suspended pending investigation, sat in a sterile HR office several floors below. She had been escorted there after the morning's headlines erupted and the footage from Flight 726 made its way to every major news outlet. She watched herself on screen, spraying disinfectant over Malachi's seat, her lips moving with those fateful words, "just being safe." The camera caught her smirk. It caught the passengers turning to look. It caught the micro-expressions that made her intent undeniable. Her hands shook now, not from remorse, but from realization. She hadn't just overstepped. She had triggered a corporate implosion, and the name Dorsey had gone from an annoyance to a professional death sentence. In that moment, as HR officials stepped in with paperwork and legal advisors sat quietly beside her, Kendra asked a question, not aloud, but in her mind. How had it gone so far? How had a single flight unraveled the career she had built through seniority, policy memorization, and calculated control of her cabin? The answer, of course, had been in front of her the entire time. She had believed her uniform protected her. She had mistaken silence for compliance. She had never imagined that the man she degraded would be the very person whose pen could erase her from the system she clung to. At the same time, Malachi stood in his hotel suite, calm and unwavering as reporters lined up outside the building. His team managed the door, filtering requests, coordinating responses, and reinforcing the message. There would be no interviews, only truth. "We are not seeking headlines," his media director repeated. "We are demanding accountability." The term "the $2.9 billion flight" had begun trending globally. Journalists dissected every frame of the leaked footage. Business experts analyzed the contract termination clause like scholars, and social justice commentators hailed the event as a landmark shift in corporate accountability culture. Malachi didn't need to speak. His actions had already become the loudest voice in the room. A call came in from the Department of Transportation requesting a meeting with Dorsey Equity's Ethics Compliance Division. Another came from Harvard Business School, asking permission to build a case study around the flight and its aftermath. Altura Aviation, once hailed as a rising model for post-pandemic aviation recovery, was now a symbol of systemic rut exposed by arrogance and assumption. Their crisis team, overwhelmed, attempted to pivot. They drafted a public apology. They issued a new inclusivity training campaign. They offered to donate to diversity initiatives. But it was too late. The narrative had formed, and it wasn't one they could control. Inside the airline's boardroom, Brandt's final move was a desperate one. He authorized a personal letter of apology to Malachi Dorsey, signed by every board member. He offered a private meeting. He proposed public restitution, but none of it could undo what had been triggered. When the letter reached Malachi's team, he didn't even pause. "No response," he said. "They're reacting to exposure, not to truth." Meanwhile, employees inside Altura's workforce began to speak out. An anonymous letter from a former black flight attendant was posted online, detailing years of silent discrimination, selective enforcement of rules, and HR suppression of formal complaints. The airline's internal culture was no longer an internal problem. It had become public property, and the public was not merciful. It began as a series of hashtags, news segments, and editorial think pieces, but within a week of the incident, the story had transformed into something far larger, a cultural pivot point wrapped in 29,000 feet of sky and sealed with a corporate collapse. The $2.9 billion flight wasn't just a headline anymore. It had become the name of a viral documentary, the subject of university lectures, a trending case study on corporate ethics, and the single most viewed exposé in streaming history. Produced with the speed and precision of a generation that demanded truth in real time, the documentary interwove mobile phone footage from passengers, leaked HR documents, Malachi Dorsey's original clause from a contract, and voiceover testimonials from passengers who'd sat silently near him. "I didn't know what to say," one woman confessed in the film, her face blurred. "I saw it. I saw the look in his eyes. I just didn't want to get involved." Another, a tech executive seated 2 rows back, broke down mid-interview. He did nothing, and they made him into a threat. The documentary was raw, uncomfortable, and unrelenting. It spared no one, not the crew, not the complicit, not the policies that enabled the abuse. And it certainly didn't spare Kendra Voss. The footage of Kendra's public statement was folded in toward the end of the film. Time to strike after the final market report had tallied the airline's collapse, after the board shakeups, and after the class action lawsuit filed by a coalition of civil rights attorneys. Kendra appeared not on a broadcast stage or behind a podium, but in a modest community center surrounded by leaders from racial justice groups. Her hair was tied back. She wore no makeup. Her voice trembled. "I didn't understand what I was doing. I thought I was doing my job. But that's not true. I was using my authority to target someone who didn't deserve it. I see that now. And I'm sorry." Her apology wasn't clean. It stumbled. It hesitated. But it was also not rehearsed. When asked why she had agreed to appear, Kendra answered, "Because I've already lost everything. The least I can do is stop pretending I didn't do anything wrong." Some called her redemption sincere. Others called it opportunistic. But no one denied the significance of her public reckoning, especially when she accepted a volunteer role with the same justice initiative that had filed the complaint against the airline. Malachi was asked for a statement. He was offered exclusive interviews, magazine profiles, a keynote at a civil liberties summit. He declined all of them, all but one. A journalist cornered him after a philanthropic board meeting, one where he had quietly announced a $10 million donation to expand equity audits across major industries. She asked the question everyone else had. "Chairman Dorsey, how do you feel now, knowing how the story ends?" He looked at her for a long moment, then answered with calm precision, "We can't rewrite history, but we can stop repeating it." The quote became immortal. It was etched on campus walls, shared across protests, and printed on murals. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't smug. It was a warning disguised as grace. Behind the scenes, the fallout continued to shape policy. Airlines across the industry revised their training programs, not with checklists, but with mandated accountability from external partners. A federal oversight committee was formed to monitor compliance breaches tied to racial bias. And for the first time in history, the Department of Transportation partnered with private equity firms to develop a real-time passenger equity audit system, Dorsey's concept, now codified in regulation. Malachi himself never used the moment to boost his brand. He didn't need to. His legacy wasn't built on the backlash. It was built on the quiet, relentless insistence that silence is not neutrality. Kendra Voss, though never employed in aviation again, continued her work within the initiative. She took every speaking opportunity offered by high schools, community colleges, and church groups, never asking for payment. "I want people to see what happens when you let prejudice become a habit," she told a youth panel in Denver. "When I saw him walk onto that plane, I made a decision in my mind about who he was. That decision led me down a path I couldn't undo. Don't be me, be better." Her eyes were tired but clear. Whether she had fully changed or not was a matter for time to decide. But she no longer hid behind procedure. That alone was a beginning. Malachi returned to his work, quiet, deliberate, strategic. He traveled often, always in first class, always unassuming. He received handwritten letters from people he'd never met. Young professionals who said he gave them courage, older activists who said he gave them proof, even one from a middle school student who'd seen the documentary in class and told her parents she wanted to grow up to be like the man who didn't get angry but still won. He didn't reply to all of them, but he kept them stacked in a private drawer in his study, not because he needed the praise, but because they reminded him that one flight, one silence, one choice can still reshape the course of a system. And on the anniversary of the incident, he stood alone at a civic lecture hosted at the Smithsonian, where a new wing had been opened documenting modern civil rights movements. There was no spotlight on him, no velvet rope around his presence, just a small plaque beside a touchscreen exhibit, Flight 726, a journey from silence to reckoning. He stood there, hands in pockets, watching as strangers read the timeline. A boy, maybe 12, looked up at him and asked, "Were you there?" Malachi smiled gently. "I was," he said. "But this story isn't about me. It's about what we all do next." And with that, he walked away. The end. If this story moved you, stirred something deep, or made you think twice about the power of silence and justice, go ahead and hit that like button and consider subscribing. It helps bring stories like this to more people who need to hear them. What did you think about Malachi's journey? Did the twists catch you off guard? And how did you feel about Kendra's transformation by the end? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're tuning in from too. Are you watching from the US, Europe, Africa, Asia? Your voice matters, and your perspective could spark the next chapter in this conversation.